Hey, this is Kit of Hard Lens Media. We're here at UIC in the city of Chicago covering the Democratic Socialists of America convention. I'm joined here today with Joseph M Schwartz. Thank you so much for joining Hard Lens Media, and to everyone who was watching this video right now. He was on our Facebook live stream being one of the main speakers, talking to all the other delegates and people who arrived to be at this convention. So, Joseph, in regards to the threat of neoliberalism and how it's affected our democracy, what's really needed to effectively make social change in order for us to have real representation and have candidates who will fight for progressive policy ideals?
Well, I think we have to see social movements that organize people and are out in the streets around things like a $15 minimum wage, indexed to inflation, free public higher education, Medicare for all, a single-payer healthcare system. But then that pressure will generate candidates who will take it up. I mean, I think you see now that very few Democrats are talking a sort of more neoliberal line because they recognize that that's somewhat unpopular and doesn't really speak to people's needs for government programs that would aid them economically. On the other hand, the corporate influence among mainstream Democrats is such that you don't see the party aggressively pushing things like single-payer or free higher public ed. They talk about the need to have broader coverage or to help more people get to university, but they're not really endorsing a full social democratic agenda. But the fact that there is protest in the streets around these issues is very important. On the other hand, there has to be the consideration, we can talk about it, what do you do to stop Trump from doing what he wants to do?
It seems though the Democrats themselves, especially the establishment Democrats, really are confused and don't know what to do, and especially in regards to pleasing their corporate donors and trying to reach out to a populist movement. And when you have Senator Chuck Schumer, who's thinking about single-payer health care, Nancy Pelosi.
Senator from Wall Street. Right. No, I think they're talking about it, but they're not embracing it and they're not pushing it. I think the other thing we have to remember is that the Democrats always, when they fight the far right, they concentrate on sort of social liberalism, integrating the corporate boardroom. And they also focus inordinately on sort of Republican improprieties, like the Russia stuff, the sort of kleptocratic nature of Trump's regime. And I don't think that really speaks to the needs of ordinary people. I'm not saying they're not unimportant issues or that there might not be grounds for impeachment or whatever, although you'd have to impeach Trump and Pence and then defeat the Republicans. But I think the fact that they're not consistently talking an economic populist program, I think if they unqualifyingly embrace Sanders' program, they'd be much better off. But that would mean no corporate funding. That would mean a very different type of grassroots-based politics. A small group of Democratic legislators and Congress people do that type of politics, but most don't. Most rely on kind of corporate donors, and to some extent, a big part, the established part of the Democratic Party is the party of Goldman Sachs. I mean, metaphorically.
Now, it's quite clear that Bernie Sanders, during his 2016 run, made a huge change in regards to how we view politics and how people view democratic socialism. However, he's still getting pushback from the corporate Democrats, especially in regards to trying to reform the Democratic Party. Can the Democratic Party be effectively reformed if the Democrats themselves are doing only half-measure responses, and can that cripple them in 2018?
Well, it could. I think the one thing they can't control is access to the ballot line. I think as with the McGovern movement in the late 60s, early 70s, what will really happen is, will there be populist Democrats primarying more conservative Democrats? Will there be populist Democrats winning the ballot line and winning open seats or real swing district seats? So I think the one vulnerability the Democrats have is that they don't control access to the ballot line. Open primaries, were not fully open, but primaries in which anyone who registers Democrat can vote, does make them vulnerable. There's a tension between the populist Democratic base of the Democratic Party and its corporate funders, and I think Sanders exposed that, but I think people like Jan Schakowsky or Pramila Jayapal or other progressives in Congress and their equivalents in state legislatures do show that if you use the ballot line and raise your own funds and are not dependent on corporate funding, you can be a pretty progressive Democrat.
Now, of course, there are critics who, when they hear the word socialism, democratic socialism, they think that it's a system that cannot work, and corporate media usually just drums to that beat, especially how they treated Bernie Sanders during the primary. Do the critics of socialism or democratic socialism, do those criticisms still stand? And if so, what's really needed to get that message out there, since corporate media will not cover populist movements?
Well, it's been defanged somewhat by the collapse of authoritarian communism, so they can't, Soviet bait anymore. I think younger people are very favorable towards socialism. They have different vague notions. Most probably think it's just the extensive social welfare states of Scandinavia, of the Nordic countries. Some may think it's sort of worker ownership, co-ops, whatever. I mean, there hasn't been a full democratic socialist regime, but I think they see that the power of working people and the benefits that working people get from strong progressive taxation in terms of high-quality public goods is really great in Scandinavia, and why can't we have that in the United States, or even the equivalent of the French welfare state? So people know that they need some form of redistribution if they're going to have security in old age retirement, if they're going to have decent career track jobs, if they're going to have health care for themselves and their family, and if they're going to have access to higher education for their children. So I think the countries, it's sort of like the late 1920s, early 1930s. I think we're in a pivotal moment where the politics of the country may become much more social democratic, but it'll take a lot of organizing, a lot of protests, and a lot of smart electoral campaigns.
Now, it's quite clear that after 2016, more Americans have distrust for the Republican and Democratic parties. 40% of Americans are identifying themselves as independents. Is there a possible scenario in which you think that perhaps in the long run, the United States will break away from a two-party establishment system and will become more of a vibrant multi-party system consisting of Green Party, Libertarians, or Socialist Alternative?
Well, there are a lot of barriers to that. There's no proportional representation in the U.S. There's no parliamentary government at the federal or state level where minority parties can be in coalition. There also is executive veto power, so you have to be able to win executive power as well as legislative, and you have to control the courts to prevent, the courts overturning legislation. So there's a strong dynamic towards two parties. Yes, could you get a third party? Sure, if there's an organic split in the Democrats and the black wing of the party, the Latino wing, the African-American wing, the labor wing walk out and form their own party, that might be a possibility for a third party, but it would rapidly have to become a first party. If you can't win executive power, the last successful third parties on the left were at the state level. The Progressive Party in Wisconsin, the Farm Labor Party in Minnesota in the 20s and 30s, they held governorships, they worked with Democrats to create legislative majorities, but after World War II, they both went back into the Democratic Party because they needed money from Washington, they had to work with Democrats, and they needed Democratic help in state legislatures to get their program through. So it's pretty hard. Could you get a third party in a state? Yeah, again, if it pretty rapidly won gubernatorial power and a majority in the legislature, but the dynamics of no proportional representation, no parliamentary government, first past the post victories, and the need to elect veto-wielding executives makes it a very structured two-party system. I think a third party to survive, if you look at Perot and other third-party attempts, has to become a first party, has to become a governing party quite quickly, or else it just becomes a fringe party. People are afraid to waste their votes.
Now, it's quite clear also here in the United States that unions have been received a blunt end due to neoliberal policies. What's needed to really break the whole stranglehold of neoliberalism and perhaps maybe make unions a more staple here in our political atmosphere?
Well, I think there's a lot of discontent among workers, immigrant workers, younger workers. I think second-generation immigrants won't take the type of repressive conditions. I think issues around scheduling, parental leave, paid sick leave. I think there's definitely going to be a movement for greater rights at the workplace. Now, whether that intersects with the drive to get people under collective bargaining agreements when the national labor relations machinery is sort of broken down, I think it's going to take much more kind of wildcat strikes, protests, withdrawal of labor. But I think, there's no future for working people if there isn't a rebuilding of the power of working class forces, and that I think primarily does have to come through sort of a union formation. But there are alternative forms of working class organization, worker centers, various forms of advocacy groups. But I think, if there isn't a revival of the American trade union movement, there won't be American democracy. And I think we have to turn the right to organize into the civil right of the 21st century.
Now, another issue that a lot of people have to deal with is the fact of our military-industrial complex and how it takes a majority of our tax dollars. And in fact, it's one of the biggest strangleholds over our economy. If there's to be any kind of real reform, how will at least populist progressive candidates be able to, and movements be able to deal with the military-industrial complex?
I think we have to make it clear that we don't really our defense policy, in quotes, is in some ways a pseudo-industrial policy and a sort of base-building policy around the globe that doesn't enhance our defense. I think we have to show that we really need massive public investment in alternative energy, mass transit, not in the military, and that the military is not suited for 21st century challenges. There's no military solution to terrorism. I mean, there's various forms of diplomacy, of espionage, whatever, but massive military interventions only create more terrorists, right? The U.S. can't police the world. It doesn't really want to build democracy. It uses democracy building as an excuse for resources. But we can't continue a military policy that's very driven by the need for oil and the need for bases all around the world. These bases are meant to extend American corporate power, not to defend the American people. So yes, I mean, in terms of the discretionary budget, the non-Medicare, Social Security, debt payment part of the budget, a good 40% of it is military. Unless we radically cut military spending, we're not going to have money to invest in human needs.
All right, and final question. In regards to our viewers who may be sitting at home feeling that perhaps if they get involved, it wouldn't matter or their vote doesn't matter, what do you want to say to people who are perhaps sitting down, not getting involved?
Right. Well, I mean, the Sanders campaign really did transform the nature of discourse in this country. Inequality is now the major issue, not being adequately addressed by mainstream corporate politicians, but being addressed. And I think that, we may well win, say, single payer in California. I think we do have to win some victories, but I think the history of the United States, if we look at the 1930s, the 1960s, in terms of the women's movement, the labor movement, the environmental movement, the LGBTQIA movement, I mean, struggle from below does win victories, and the contradiction of capitalist democracy is it's too capitalist to be fully democratic, but it is also somewhat too democratic to be fully capitalist. So if we build social movements and we put into power people who are responsible to those movements and come out of those movements, we can achieve democratic change. We did in the 1930s and the 1960s. I think in the 20-teens, this will be a pivotal era in American politics.
All right, well, Joseph, thank you so much for joining Lens Media. And to all our viewers, peace.